The morning sun filtered through tall pines, spreading golden light across the quiet valley of northern Idaho. The air was cool, clean, and still, except for the soft crunch of boots against forest soil. A small search team moved carefully through the woods, their breath forming faint clouds in the crisp air. It was the spring of 1986, and no one in the small town of Claybrook expected what the day would reveal. They were searching for Hannah Cole, a 27-year-old art teacher who had vanished 2 nights earlier after leaving a friend's gathering. Her car had been found neatly parked near an old forest trail just outside town, keys still in the ignition, as if she had stepped out only for a moment, but she never returned. The disappearance of Hannah struck Claybrook deeply. She wasn't just known, she was loved. Her classroom walls were painted with color and joy, her voice gentle and steady. Each year she led the town's children in making murals that celebrated Idaho's landscapes, and everyone who knew her remembered her laughter like sunlight through the window. 2 days earlier, she had attended a small dinner at her friend Caroline Blake's home. Around 10 in the evening, Hannah said she was driving back to her apartment near the town's edge. The route was familiar, a winding road that cut through tall pines and curved around a narrow riverbank. But somewhere along that stretch of road, Hannah disappeared from sight. By the next morning, when she failed to arrive at work, her students grew restless. Caroline called the school, then the sheriff's office. Within hours, volunteers formed search teams. The small-town spirit came alive as neighbors brought food, flashlights, and maps. Sheriff Raymond Danner, a quiet man with decades in the field, coordinated the effort. He knew every road and every creek around Claybrook. But as the sun dipped that evening and no sign of Hannah appeared, unease settled over the town. Searchers combed the forest by day and left candles burning by night. Helicopters scanned the ridgelines and divers checked shallow ponds. When her car was located, doors unlocked, purse inside, it only deepened the mystery. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints, no broken twigs leading into the forest. It was as if the woods had quietly swallowed the night whole. Days turned into weeks. Flyers with Hannah's picture, bright eyes, brown hair, soft smile, were taped to grocery store doors, pinned to telephone poles, and placed in church bulletins. Caroline visited the Cole family every evening, bringing home-cooked meals and sitting with Hannah's parents, Margaret and Samuel Cole. As they stared at the phone that never rang, the story spread across Idaho. Local news anchors described the case with hushed voices, calling it one of the state's most puzzling disappearances. But behind the reports, Claybrook's townsfolk held on to faith. The community gathered each Sunday, praying under candlelight, believing she would come home. Sheriff Danner followed every lead. He interviewed hikers, campers, and truck drivers who passed through that night. Some remembered a faint light near the old Hollow Creek Trail, a stretch known for its narrow bends and abandoned cabins from early logging days. But searchers found nothing, only moss-covered boards and empty structures half reclaimed by the forest. By late summer, the search slowed. The sheriff's department, exhausted and short on new information, stored Hannah's belongings, her purse, sketchbook, and car keys in a sealed evidence locker. But in Claybrook, her presence lingered everywhere. Children still pointed to the mural she had painted at the town library, mountains, rivers, and a sky of deep blue that seemed almost alive. Her parents kept her apartment untouched, with her art supplies laid neatly on the table, brushes still resting in jars of faded water. Each passing year added another layer of quiet remembrance. The town held candlelight walks every April in her name, the same month she had disappeared. Caroline, her closest friend, eventually moved to nearby Coeur d'Alene but returned annually to place wildflowers by the trailhead. As time stretched forward, life went on, but the question remained, where was Hannah Cole? By the late 1990s, Claybrook had changed. New families arrived, the logging mill closed, and cell towers rose where wooden watch cabins once stood. Yet the old story stayed alive, shared in whispers by parents to their children, who had grown up seeing Hannah's smiling face on the town's memory wall. Then, in 2008, more than 2 decades later, the town would finally learn that the forest had kept its secret carefully preserved. It began when Mark Taylor, a property developer from Spokane, purchased a section of land near Hollow Creek to survey for renovation. He and his team planned to restore a few of the weathered cabins into rental lodges for hikers. One afternoon in early May, while inspecting the second cabin on the property, a crew member noticed something unusual. Beneath a loose floorboard, they found an old metal bracelet, tarnished but still intact. It was engraved with the initials HC. The crew turned the bracelet over to local authorities, who transferred it to the Claybrook Sheriff's Department. When the evidence was logged, one of the newer deputies, Emily Ross, noticed the engraving and cross-referenced it against old missing person files. Her eyes widened when she saw the name Hannah Cole, 1986. Sheriff Danner had long since retired, but his successor, Sheriff Owen Leary, reopened the file immediately. The bracelet wasn't conclusive proof, but it was the first physical trace of Hannah in over 20 years. Leary and his team visited the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of pine and dust, sunlight falling through cracks in the wooden walls. They marked off the area where the bracelet had been found, then began a slow, careful excavation of the space around it. What they found next changed the course of the entire case. Behind one of the cabin's interior panels, near the fireplace, they uncovered a small compartment sealed with aged wood. Inside it lay fragments of fabric, faint traces of paint, and what appeared to be the rusted handle of a brush. Forensic experts from Boise were called in to assist. They collected every fragment and logged it meticulously. DNA extraction began at the state lab that summer, using advanced methods that hadn't existed in the 1980s. Weeks later, the results came back, a confirmed match to Hannah Cole. The discovery reignited Claybrook's memory of her. The local paper printed a special front-page story titled, "Evidence Found in Abandoned Cabin May Solve Claybrook's Oldest Mystery." Residents gathered once again in candlelight vigils, not in sorrow but in quiet reflection. They finally had a place to remember her, a piece of truth to hold on to after so many unanswered years. But for Sheriff Leary and his team, the bracelet and the DNA raised even more questions. Why had Hannah been inside that cabin? Who had been there with her? A new investigation began, this time with technology and determination that the small department could only dream of in 1986. The forensic team re-examined the cabin inch by inch. Hidden beneath layers of dust on the floorboards, they discovered faint shoe impressions, different sizes overlapping. Using modern digital mapping, the lab identified at least 2 separate patterns. One belonged to a common brand of hiking boots sold widely in the 1980s. The other, however, matched a lesser-known outdoor brand distributed mainly through a specific outfitter chain based in Idaho and Montana. Detective Avery Nolan, who had joined the case after returning from state training, traced that information to old store receipts archived from Claybrook's general supply shop. It was there, on yellowed ledger pages, that she found a name written in faded ink: Tom Laird. He had been a carpenter who worked sporadically on local cabin repairs in the mid-80s. The store owner remembered him vaguely, a quiet man who traveled between towns for seasonal work. No one in Claybrook had seen him in years. When the team looked deeper, they discovered that Laird had moved out of Idaho shortly after 1986, settling in Montana under a different mailing address. The coincidence caught their attention. Detective Nolan requested Laird's last known contact information and began tracing his trail through old tax, documents, and contractor registrations. As she built her report, she pinned Hannah's photograph above her desk, right beside the faded picture of the cabin. To her, this was no longer just a file. It was the continuation of a promise that Claybrook had never stopped keeping. When Detective Avery Nolan reopened the file, the walls of the Claybrook Sheriff's Department filled once more with maps, Photographs and strings of red tape tracing the routes around Hollow Creek. The office smelled of coffee and paper, signs of long nights spent piecing together what time had hidden. New evidence from the cabin had changed everything. The bracelet engraved with HC and the confirmed DNA match meant the department now had a clear direction. Still, no one could yet explain what had led Hannah Cole to that cabin, or how she had ended up there without anyone seeing her. Detective Nolan spent evenings studying the old reports left by Sheriff Danner. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting careful. Each line carried traces of the original search, interviews with hikers, statements from townsfolk, timelines carefully drawn by hand. Among them, one name appeared several times: Tom Laird, the carpenter who had helped repair bridges and cabins along Hollow Creek in the mid-1980s. In those records, Laird had been described as quiet, hard-working, and polite. No one had suspected him of anything, but the timing of his departure, just weeks after Hannah's disappearance, seemed too close to ignore. Detective Nolan requested background information through interagency channels. It took weeks, but a thin folder eventually arrived from Montana authorities. Inside were copies of utility bills, an employment history, and a driver's license photo. Tom Laird had lived a quiet life in the years since. He owned a small woodworking shop in a town near Missoula. Nothing about him drew attention. He had never been arrested, never had complaints filed against him. But when Nolan compared the old purchase receipt for those hiking boots from 1986 with recent photos, something clicked. The same size, same brand preference noted in later years. It was not proof, but it was a path forward. She decided to visit him. It was late October when she and her partner, Deputy Cole Raines, drove north through the winding mountain highways that connected Idaho to western Montana. The air outside was cool and fragrant with pine. As they approached the small town where Laird now lived, the landscape felt strangely familiar. Old timber roads, narrow rivers, and abandoned cabins scattered like forgotten stories along the forest edge. They found Laird's workshop on the outskirts of town. It stood beside a gravel road surrounded by stacks of lumber and the scent of cedar. Through the open door, they saw him, a man in his late 60s, tall, silver-haired, sanding a wooden chair with quiet focus. When he looked up, his eyes carried a mix of curiosity and calm. "Morning," he greeted. "Can I help you folks?" Detective Nolan introduced herself and explained that she was revisiting a historical case from Idaho involving old cabins near Hollow Creek. Laird's expression remained steady, though his hands paused briefly before resting the sandpaper on the table. He said he remembered working there long ago. That was a lifetime back, he added softly. "I built half those cabins with reclaimed logs," Nolan nodded. "Do you remember anyone from that time? Locals, visitors, anyone who came by while you were working?" He thought for a moment, then shrugged. "A few hikers, maybe. Sometimes people stop to look around. Can't say I recall names." She showed him a photograph of Hannah Cole. The image, though decades old, still radiated warmth through its faded edges. Laird studied it longer than expected. "She looks familiar," he said at last. "Was she from that town, Claybrook, right?" "Yes," Nolan replied, her tone gentle. "She disappeared in 1986. We found some of her belongings recently in one of those cabins." His eyes shifted slightly, a flicker of something unspoken. He nodded slowly, then said, "That's a shame. Sorry to hear it." The detectives thanked him for his time and left. But as they walked back to the car, Nolan felt an instinct tug at her thoughts. Laird's tone had been polite, but his reaction, measured, almost rehearsed, didn't sit right. That evening, she filed a follow-up request to check Laird's name through state forensic databases. Modern systems sometimes held background DNA traces from old licensing forms or medical certifications. It was a long shot, but worth it. 2 weeks later, the lab confirmed a partial match between Laird's profile and the unidentified secondary DNA found near Hannah's remains in the cabin. It wasn't a full match yet, but the probability score was high enough to merit further testing. Detective Nolan immediately coordinated with Montana authorities for an official warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample. When they arrived at Laird's workshop again, the winter air carried flakes of snow drifting between the trees. He appeared calm, and when asked, he voluntarily agreed to provide the sample, saying, "If it helps you close your case, I'll do it." The sample was sent to Boise for analysis. While the results were pending, Nolan's team continued reviewing archival material from the old Claybrook files. They found an unprocessed film roll among the 1986 evidence, photographs taken during the first week of the search. When developed, one of the photos revealed something subtle but important: a blue pickup truck parked near the Hollow Creek trailhead. The plate was partially visible, enough for modern software to reconstruct the missing characters. It matched a registration once owned by Tom Laird. The connection grew clearer with each new layer of evidence. In January 2009, the Boise lab delivered the report. It confirmed that the DNA collected from Laird was an exact match to the secondary profile found in the cabin. The probability of random coincidence was virtually zero. Detective Nolan read the result in silence, her breath steady but heart full. She called Sheriff Leary, who immediately authorized cooperation with Montana authorities for Laird's formal arrest and transfer. The following week, local officers in Missoula approached Laird at his workshop. He was cooperative, composed, and said little. When asked if he understood the reason for their presence, he nodded once and quietly said, "I remember that place." Back in Idaho, the Claybrook courthouse prepared for the first hearing. The town that had once spent years searching now prepared to listen. News of the breakthrough spread quickly. Residents gathered in cafes and community halls, reading the morning paper with mixed emotions: relief, disbelief, and something deeper, quieter, the feeling that patience and faith had not been in vain. In the sheriff's department, Hannah's old file, once filled with handwritten notes and fading photographs, was finally stamped with a single new word: resolved. Detective Nolan and Sheriff Leary stood together as the archival clerk placed the completed file on the evidence shelf. Neither spoke. The silence in the room carried the weight of time itself. The next step was preparing the case for trial. Over the following months, the prosecution carefully built a timeline, linking every detail: the cabin, the bracelet, the fabric fragments, and the DNA, to the same place and time. Witness interviews, old store records, and employment documents aligned with remarkable precision. In June 2010, the first pretrial hearings began. The Claybrook courthouse, which hadn't seen a major case in years, filled once more with reporters and families who remembered the early days of Hannah's disappearance. For the Cole family, the long wait had been softened by grace. Margaret and Samuel, both now in their 70s, attended each hearing quietly, hand in hand. Caroline Blake, Hannah's closest friend, returned to town to stand beside them. She said to a local journalist, "We spent half our lives wondering what happened. Now we know she wasn't forgotten." During testimony, Detective Nolan explained the decades-long trail that had led to this moment: the rediscovered bracelet, the advanced DNA work, and the final match that tied everything together. Every word she spoke carried both precision and heart. She said, "We didn't find the answer by luck. We found it because people refused to stop caring." The proceedings lasted several days. For Claybrook, the story that had once lived only in whispers now echoed through courtrooms and television screens. At last, the state presented its complete evidence: the bracelet, the fabric fibers, the verified DNA, and the reconstructed truck registration that placed Laird near Hollow Creek on the exact weekend Hannah vanished. With each exhibit shown, the courtroom filled with the quiet hum of truth resurfacing after decades of stillness. Detective Nolan watched from her seat, steady and composed. She had followed this story through archives, woods, and winter roads. Now, standing on the edge of resolution, she felt only gratitude, for science, for persistence, and for every person who had carried Hannah's name through the years. The trial date was scheduled for spring. When it came, the entire town seemed to pause. Storefronts lowered flags, church bells rang softly, and the Claybrook Library set up a small corner display of Hannah's paintings, the same ones she had created with her students so many years before. Each canvas showed open skies, rivers and trees that stretched upward into light, and in every brushstroke it felt as though Hannah herself was still there, her hand guiding the colors, her spirit painting peace into every heart that remembered her. The spring of 2011 brought quiet sunlight to Claybrook, Idaho, a season that seemed gentler than the ones before. The mountains still carried snow on their peaks, but the valley below had turned bright and green again. On Main Street, people spoke softly about the trial that was set to begin in the county courthouse, a red brick building that had stood since before most residents were born. Inside, rows of wooden benches filled with townspeople, journalists, and faces from the past. Every eye was drawn to the front, where Tom Laird sat beside his attorney. He looked older than the photos the papers showed, his shoulders slightly stooped, his gray hair combed back neatly. To his left sat Detective Avery Nolan, called as the state's key witness. For the Cole family, the trial marked an ending and a beginning all at once. Margaret and Samuel Cole sat in the front row holding hands. Between them lay a folded photograph of Hannah, worn at the edges from years of being carried in wallets and pockets. Behind them, Caroline Blake, Hannah's old friend, watched quietly, her expression soft but steady. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell into a deep silence broken only by the creak of benches. The state presented its case first. Prosecutor Daniel Grayson, a composed man with a calm, deliberate voice, began by laying out the timeline. In August 1986, 24-year-old Hannah Cole vanished from her home in Claybrook, Idaho. For more than 2 decades, her disappearance remained a mystery. That changed when new evidence surfaced in Frontier, evidence that led directly to this man, he pointed gently toward Laird. The defendant remained expressionless. Grayson detailed how the discovery of Hannah's bracelet in the abandoned cabin had reopened the investigation, how modern DNA methods linked Laird to the crime scene, and how the truck registration placed him near Hollow Creek at the precise time she went missing. One by one, exhibits were presented. The bracelet, the boots, the reconstructed maps, the old photographs. Each piece was placed carefully before the jury, a puzzle once scattered now slowly fitting together. Detective Nolan took the stand, her voice clear and unwavering. She described the long process, the nights of searching through archives, the rediscovered film rolls, and the moment the lab confirmed the DNA match. It wasn't about luck, she told the court. It was about never giving up on a woman who deserved to be found. Her testimony moved the room. Even those who had known the story for decades felt its weight again, heavier now that the truth had formed. When the defense began its cross-examination, they argued that the DNA sample might have been the result of environmental contamination, touch transfer, perhaps from shared objects at the cabin site. They emphasized that the state could not definitively prove how or when the DNA was deposited, but the prosecution countered with forensic experts who explained in detail how the DNA was found in protected, undisturbed areas of the cabin, sealed beneath layers of soil and debris. Every scientific word carried the quiet certainty of truth. The turning point came when a new witness was called, a retired forest ranger named Raymond Ellis, who had once patrolled Hollow Creek during the 1980s. He testified that in August 1986, he had seen a blue pickup parked by the trailhead, with lumber in the back and a man matching Laird's description loading supplies. At the time, Ellis hadn't thought much of it, but when he later heard about Hannah's disappearance, the memory returned. That single recollection, supported by the photographic evidence of the truck, sealed the narrative's consistency. By the third week, closing statements approached. Prosecutor Grayson stood before the jury and spoke with measured gravity. This case is not just about science or timelines. It's about a promise that no matter how many years pass, the truth does not disappear. It waits. And when the right hands keep looking, it comes forward, even through silence. The jury retired for deliberation that afternoon. Outside, a light rain fell across the courthouse lawn. Margaret and Samuel waited together in the lobby, holding the photo between them. Hours passed slowly. Reporters whispered, cameras clicked, and the air felt suspended, time folding upon itself. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled again. The foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly as she read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Thomas Laird, guilty. A hush spread through the room. Margaret covered her mouth as Samuel placed his arm around her shoulders. Caroline reached for their hands from behind, tears gathering quietly in her eyes. Laird sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly toward the gallery, then lowered his head. The judge set sentencing for the following month. For Claybrook, the verdict was both heavy and healing. The newspaper headline the next morning read, "Justice after 25 years. Truth emerges from Hollow Creek." Detective Nolan walked the trail once more that spring, this time not in search of evidence but of closure. The forest had changed since 1986, trees grown taller, paths softened by moss. But the cabin still stood. Sunlight cut through broken planks, illuminating the place where the story had once begun and ended. Inside, she placed a single wildflower, a white columbine, on the spot where Hannah's bracelet had been found. For a moment the air felt still, as though the forest itself had paused to remember. Later that week, the Cole family held a small memorial near the creek. Friends from the past returned, former classmates, teachers, and townspeople who had joined search parties all those years ago.